My name is Ian Chinich, and I'm a student at Boston University and member of Students for Justice in Palestine. This is the second event in our first Israel Apartheid Week at Boston University, and it is following on the heels of a successful film screening last night. There's going to be further announcements of other events that we're holding this week, and also some of the events other groups are holding this week as well, right before the Q&A. This week of focus on the treatment of Palestinians by the Israeli state comes at a precarious time for the indigenous people of the region. It has been a year since the mass destruction of Gaza by Israeli military forces using weapons provided by our tax dollars from the United States. Since that time, the blockade has continued, along with increasing settlement, housing evictions, and demolitions directed at displacing the Palestinian people from the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The highlight of our week of action in Boston is tonight's event, and we are blessed to be joined by world-renowned intellectual Noam Chomsky as he addresses one of the most important issues of our time. Noam Chomsky is a prolific author and professor emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he has taught for over half a century. Among his many dozens of books are Rogue States, The Rule of Force in World Affairs, The New Military Humanism, Lessons from Kosovo, Fateful Triangle, the United States, Israel, and the Palestinians, and Manufacturing Consent. Professor Chomsky has been a champion of justice for decades, writing on the Middle East, Vietnam, Latin America, East Timor, and domestic U.S. policy. He is widely considered one of the most important historians and analysts on the issue of the Palestinian and U.S. involvement, and his works have not just educated an American generation, but touched people all over the world. The New York Times book review has called him the most important intellectual alive. It is said that Howard Zinn opened the eyes of Americans to their own history and the history of social movements here. But of equal importance is the manner in which his friend and colleague Noam Chomsky has fundamentally changed the way Americans look at foreign policies of our own government. The issue of Palestine has been so tragically and inadequately recognized, and I do not think that anyone who is a student of the conflict and the issue can hope to study it without reading Professor Chomsky's work. You are all witnessing a historic event tonight at Boston University at a very historic time in the history of the movement for social justice in Palestine. Please join with me in recognizing Professor Noam Chomsky.
Thank you. Well, since this is Anti-Apartheid Week, I should say something about South Africa. Actually, it's a topic I haven't talked much about, but occasionally I have. One time I recall was in Israel 13 years ago. This was in 1997. I gave the keynote address at Ben Gurion University at a 30th anniversary conference dealing with the 1967 war. Perhaps I can just read a brief part of what I said there. I think it's still pertinent. And incidentally, it elicited no critical comment from the panel of Israeli scholars and well-known political figures who were the commentators at this talk, probably because it was so familiar and uncontroversial. So if you don't mind listening to something familiar and uncontroversial by Israeli standards, here it is. Here's what I said. I said, no one familiar with the situation in the territories created by the Rabin, Peres, Netanyahu governments and their predecessors will fail to recognize the picture given in a standard work of African history, which I then quoted from, and I'll quote now. South African retention of effective power through its officials in the Bantustans, its overwhelming economic influence and security arrangements give to this initiative of elections in the Bantustans elements of a farce. However unlikely candidates, as were the Bantustans, for any meaningful independent existence, their expanding bureaucracies provided jobs for new strata of educated Africans tied to the system in a new way, and a basis of accumulation for a small number of Africans with access to loans and political influence. Repression, too, could be indigenized through developing homeland policy and army personnel. On the fringe of the Bantustans, border industry growth centers were planned as a means of freeing capital from some of the restraints imposed on industrial expansion elsewhere, and to take advantage of virtually captive and particularly cheap labor. Within the homelands, economic development was more a matter of advertising brochures than actual practical activity, although some officials in South Africa understood the needs from their own perspective for some kind of revitalization of the homelands to prevent their economies from collapsing even further. Well, that's the end of the quote about South Africa. I'll continue with my own comments at the conference. So far, Israeli officials have not recognized any need to keep the economies of the cantons from collapsing even further, though sooner or later they may see the merits in the demands of Israeli industrialists, and now I'm quoting from a publication of Israeli industrialists, demand for a transition from colonialism to neocolonialism in the territories, with the collaboration of representatives of the Palestinian bourgeoisie. Well, that's from that conference. 13 years later, it hasn't happened, though the Netanyahu government now may be veering in the direction of the of the Israeli industrialists who thought it might be a good time to move from straight colonialism to neocolonialism. The economies, however, in the cantons are still collapsing. Here's a quote from the latest World Bank report on the West Bank. Over time, the apparatus of Israeli control itself has gradually become more sophisticated and effective in its ability to interfere in and affect every aspect of Palestinian life, including job opportunities, work, and earnings. Extensive and multi-layered, the apparatus of control includes a permit system, physical obstacles known as closures, restricted roads, and prohibitions on entering large areas of land in the West Bank, and most notably the separation barrier, which we should actually think of as an annexation wall. It's turned the West Bank into a fragmented set of social and economic islands or enclaves cut off from one another. And Israel has finally begun to adopt the South African policy of what they called indigenization of repression. There's now several armies, in fact, one technically under the control of the State Department, run by General Keith Dayton, with the cooperation of the Jordanian dictatorship and Israel. There's another which is less known and allegedly much harsher, under the control of the CIA, so under no supervision, the General Intelligence and the Presidential Guard. And the Dayton Army, General Dayton Army, has won considerable praise from the Obama administration. Senator Kerry, who's kind of our senator, is kind of the point man on international affairs for the Obama administration in an important speech. He presented this standard party line, U.S. a neutral broker, trying to bring the two sides together, Israel yearning for a legitimate partner for peace, but it's never had one. And a couple of months ago, he said, well, now it seems that Israel might have a legitimate partner for peace. And he referred to specifically to the very effective performance of the General Dayton Army during the attack on Gaza. It was feared that there would be some protests in the West Bank while Israel was slaughtering Palestinians in Gaza and destroying what was left of that miserable area. But Kerry says, turned out there were no protests at all. The Dayton Army was capable of repressing even any expression of sympathy for Palestinians under Israeli attack. And that shows that maybe Israel has a legitimate partner for peace at last, and we should therefore proceed to support such progressive policies as an indigenized army trained by the U.S. with Jordanian and Israeli help that can even go so far as to repress even an expression of sympathy while the U.S. and Israel are carrying out massive atrocities. This is the progressive position in the United States. I won't talk about the rest of the spectrum. Of course, Israel, while breaking up the cantons so that they become separated from one another, pretty much unlivable, more or less like the Bantustans. In fact, in many respects, worse than the Bantustans, because as that quote explained about South African history, white South nationalists needed the black population. That's their labor force. Israel would be delighted to get rid of the Palestinian population. They don't want to have any responsibility for them at all. If they can disappear, that's fine. So therefore, they don't even have to take the few steps that South African nationalists did to try to make the homelands viable. Of course, South Africa tried to get the Bantustans homelands recognized internationally, but that didn't work at all. In fact, I think the only country that recognized them was Israel, this is even before the conquest of the West Bank and Gaza. Well, U.S.-Israeli policy is not satisfied with breaking up the West Bank into cantons along the lines that the World Bank described. It's also specifically designed to separate the West Bank from Gaza, the other part of Palestine, repressing any sign of sympathy for Gazans by force is one illustration of that policy. This is, of course, in violation of international agreements, but the title of one of the books that Ian mentioned deals with that question. It's called Rogue States. When a country is openly and proudly in violation of international law and norms like our country, it just doesn't matter what international agreements are. They're irrelevant, not just in this case. Gaza itself is being very consciously strangled so that nothing beyond bare survival is possible. You don't want to let it go beyond that, or there might be an international outcry, but as long as the animals stay alive, it's okay. Now, this is all being done with the cooperation of the Egyptian dictatorship, just as the colonial stance of the occupation of the West Bank is carried out with the Jordanian dictatorship, both of them close U.S. allies. Both of them fear independent nationalism and democracy in Palestine, in fact, anywhere in the Arab world, just as the U.S. and Israel do. This is a continuation of long-standing U.S. policy, which has long been directed to giving the most possible, strongest possible support to brutal dictatorships and centers of radical Islamic fundamentalism, and remains so. So the most important ally of the United States in the region, Saudi Arabia, is far and away the most extreme repressive state in the region, and is also the center of jihadism, radical Islamic jihadism. It's not just a coincidence that the people who bombed in 9/11 were almost all from Saudi Arabia, and that Osama bin Laden himself is. In fact, Saudi Arabia, with U.S. support and British support, the British has supported radical Islamic fundamentalism for years. That's the source of the radical Islamization of Pakistan under worst of the Pakistani dictators, all of them supported by the U.S., Zia-ul-Haq in the 1980s, Reagan's special friend, who with Saudi economic and other aid and strong U.S. support, carried out the radical Islamization of Pakistan, spreading madrasas over the country, encouraging jihadism and so on, all with our support, strong support. And that's been a characteristic pattern for both the traditional imperial powers, the United States and Britain, and for good reasons. The threat in the region is independent nationalism, what's called radical nationalism. Radical is just a word for independent, because that's exactly what might undermine imperial control. Radical Islamic fundamentalism and jihadism and so on may be a little bit of a nuisance, but they're not serious threats to control of the region, which is essential. That has always been recognized to be for decades, since the First World War, in fact, when oil was discovered, and before that for other reasons. Well, what the World Bank described really shouldn't surprise anyone who's familiar with recent history since 1967, since the conquest of the territories, because what the World Bank described is just a continuation of perfectly open policies, not concealed policies, which are designed to that end. Actually, it was expressed quite well by Moshe Dayan, who was defense minister in 1967 and responsible for the occupied territories. He explained that we should tell the Palestinians, we should make it clear to the Palestinians in the territories that we have nothing to offer them. They will live like dogs, and whoever leaves will leave. And we'll see where that leads. By now, plenty have left. Probably the majority of the Christian Arab population, much of those who are capable of leaving, who have the means to, just don't want to live like dogs, and know that that's the way they're going to live, because that's the U.S.-Israeli policy. That's what's happened. The detailed plans have changed from one government to another, but the general picture has remained quite stable. Of course, this is carried. Diana is banking. He then and his successors have been banking on U.S. support, and so far it's been unflagging, almost unflagging. If you look closely, there are some interesting exceptions, which are pretty revealing. So, for example, in the mid-1970s, this is under Yitzhak Rabin, the peacemaker, Israel began to develop a town east of Jerusalem. Jerusalem doesn't mean Jerusalem anymore. It means some huge area, Greater Jerusalem, which incorporates Jerusalem as a small part. Incidentally, everything that Israel does in Jerusalem is doubly illegal. It's in violation of international law, like everything else in the territories, but it's also in violation of explicit Security Council resolutions, which the U.S. in fact supported. This is back in the late 60s, when the U.S. was still part of the world on this issue. I'll talk about that. But there's a vastly expanded area called Jerusalem, which Israel is essentially annexed. And to the east of it, the Rabin government began to establish a town, Ma'ale Adumim, and the idea was to bisect the West Bank. If you look at the map, this town, Ma'ale Adumim, which now exists, tens of thousands of people, its borders extend almost to Jericho, which means essentially bisecting the West Bank. There are a couple of other salients in the north which break up the rest of the territory. Now, in order to develop Ma'ale Adumim, of course, they had to kick out the population. Well, okay, they're gone. Actually, by now, I suppose they're completely gone. The last time I was there in 1997, they were still living in tin huts up in the hills and so on. But that's unproblematic. Certainly, it's unproblematic for a country like the United States, which is based on not just dispossession of the indigenous population, but extermination of them. Settler colonialism is far and away the most extreme sadistic form of imperialism for pretty obvious reasons. Our own history is a perfect example. However, what Israel wants to do is to close up, to bisect the West Bank properly, is to settle the region, a short distance between Greater Jerusalem and Ma'ale Adumim. It's a corridor called E1, and they want to build there, and then you have it broken up completely. But for whatever reason, the U.S. didn't want them to build there. And when the U.S. gives instructions, Israel follows. That's the way the world works. The world works pretty much like the mafia. There's a Don, namely us, and when the Don says something, you do it or else, or you're in trouble. And in the case of Israel, it's particularly so. They're particularly dependent on the U.S. So Israel has essentially told them you can't settle in E1. And they don't like it, but you got to listen to the Godfather. Actually, what they're doing is sort of sneaking their way around it, hoping the Godfather, now Obama, won't notice or pretend not to notice. So they just built a big police station in E1 for the whole area, what's called Judea and Samaria. And the way they say it was okay, they're not violating U.S. orders because they didn't do it with state funds. They got rich Jewish donors in Brooklyn or somewhere to pour in money to build the police station, so it really isn't state funds. So it's not in violation of the Godfather's orders, and maybe you won't notice. So far, Obama hasn't deigned to notice. But nevertheless, it's an interesting case. It shows that if the United States wants to do something, even something which is quite vital to Israeli plans and policies, all it has to do is say so. Nothing else is required, and they do it. It's case after case of it. This is one interesting one, which is significant if we want to think about what we should be doing. Well, there are many analogies drawn constantly between Israel and South Africa. They're varying merit. I don't use most of them myself, but the one I mentioned I think is appropriate. And there's another one which I think is even more pertinent, although I've never heard it mentioned, so I'll mention it now. 50 years ago, the apartheid regime in South Africa, the white nationalist regime, was becoming well aware that it was on the way to becoming a pariah state, just as Israel is aware of that today. And the reactions are strikingly similar. If you go back to South African history and take a look at the way they reacted in the early 60s and the way Israel's reacting now, it's remarkable similarities worth looking at. Large-scale information campaigns to convince the world of how righteous we are and how we're right about everything and so on. There's the kind of circling the wagons, kind of pulling in to defend yourself from the irrational, hostile world. There's the ultra-nationalist tendencies in both cases, very striking today in Israel, and a lot more. In 1958, the South African foreign minister informed the American ambassador, I'll quote him now, that strong resolutions, UN resolutions against South Africa that were beginning to be passed at that time by a large majority at the United Nations, he informed the American ambassador that they don't matter. Here's what he said. He said, "What matters more than all other votes put together is the position of the United States in view of its predominant position of leadership in the Western world," meaning you guys are the Don and the other Western countries shine your shoes, and as long as we have your vote, we don't really have to worry much about anything else, certainly not the third world, forget about them, former colonial countries. Well, what he was saying is there's really only one vote at the United Nations, and that's an observation that gained a lot more force in the following years, in fact, dramatically so. The history of the relation between the United States and the UN is very revealing. worth taking one index, as many, is just vetoes. That's the strongest way to violate a UN resolution is to veto it. And not everyone has the capacity to do that, but a couple of countries do, 5. In the early days of the United Nations, the U.S. government was very supportive of the UN, thought it was terrific, best thing since chocolate cake. The reason was that U.S. domination of the world was so overwhelming that the states in the UN had to do everything the U.S. wanted. There was just no choice. So the U.S. could turn the UN into a weapon against the Soviet Union, its main enemy. And you could pass all sorts of strong resolutions against the Russians, and everybody would obediently vote. So in the early days of the UN, the Soviet Union was vetoing lots of resolutions. And that had an interesting consequence in the Western U.S. and British intellectual communities. So you had distinguished figures, leading anthropologists and others, psychiatrists, trying to figure out what is it about the Russian character that makes them get up at the UN and say no. And the major theory, when I was a grad student at this time, we thought it was comical, like 5 of us in the country. We used to call the main theory was that the Russians raise their children with swaddling clothes, and that makes it negative. So therefore, when they get to the UN, they say no. We used to call it diaperology, but it was a very widespread theory. Major figures. I don't want to embarrass anybody, but major figures who you know and read. But in the 50s, it began to change a little. First of all, the industrial countries began to recover from the war, so it became a little more varied. And then decolonization set in. Decolonization didn't really free the colonial countries, but it gave them a degree of independence. And they acted on it. There was a non-aligned movement and so on. By the mid-60s, the UN was not strictly under U.S. control. And attitudes totally changed. Up till 1965, the UN was a darling. The U.S. never vetoed anything. From 1965 on, the vetoes began. If you take the period from 65 till the present, the U.S. is way in the lead in vetoing Security Council resolutions. Britain is second, and the other 3 are not even within shouting distance. And it makes sense. The UN was no longer under control. In fact, the U.S. went out of its way to destroy major sectors of the UN, like UNESCO and UNCTAD, the Development Agency, and so on. That's what the South African ambassador was already recognizing that in 1958. He said, look, there's only one vote at the UN, yours, and what the other guys do doesn't make any difference. And that became radically more so in the years that followed on issue after issue, not just Israel. The U.S. votes essentially alone. Not always. Israel usually goes along. Sometimes there's a Pacific island, Palau or something. But sometimes the U.S. can't even bring them along. So last year, for example, there was a vote at the General Assembly to put some controls on the arms trade. The arms trade is killing millions of people around the world. It was supported almost unanimously. The U.S. voted against it, but not alone. Israel wouldn't go along this time. It was too much, or even Palau. But Zimbabwe went along. So it was the U.S. and Zimbabwe against the world on that. That was too embarrassing to report, so you have to look up the UN records to find it out. But this is true on issue after issue. The U.S. and Israel are usually alone on Israeli-related issues, but it's not unique. It has to do with our role in the world, worth understanding. And the South African minister 50 years ago, he understood it very well. And as you see, you take a look at the history of South Africa, you see how it worked out. The U.S. continued to support the apartheid regime, even in the late 70s. By the late 70s, opposition was becoming pretty widespread. Corporations were beginning to pull out, or following the Sullivan principle, as it was called, which the first boycotts began. I think the first one here was in Hampshire College in 1977, and then they spread elsewhere. By the 1980s, Congress was passing resolutions calling for an end to aid to South Africa. The Reagan administration continued to support South Africa very strongly, but it had to evade congressional resolutions, evade business opposition. It's a real powerful state interest, and it wasn't a joke. Through the 1980s, South African military operations, terrorist operations supported by the United States, killed about 1.5 million people just in the surrounding countries, let alone what was happening in South Africa. So this is, and all with U.S. support. It makes Reagan's terrorism elsewhere, it sort of pales in comparison. So in Central America, which is the most obvious region of Reaganite terrorism, maybe a couple 100,000 people were killed. In the Middle East, the U.S. supported every Israeli atrocity. The worst of them was actually the worst of the 5 Israeli invasions of Lebanon. Every one of them was awful, but the worst was in 1982 with the strong support of the United States that killed maybe 15,000 to 20,000 people. It extended to Beirut, which the bombing of Beirut in that invasion was it killed about twice as many people as the Serbian bombing in Sarajevo, in about 1/20th of the time, just to give you a measure of the intensity, and you can remember the reactions. That invasion was quite clearly understood in Israel and the United States. It was an attempt to prevent embarrassing diplomatic initiatives by the PLO, which were threatening U.S.-Israeli control over the West Bank. It was a war for the West Bank, as was described frankly in Israel. Now, there were pretexts concocted for the American audience. So there are stories about how the Galilee northern Israel was being showered with Palestinian rockets and so on. It's a total fabrication. In fact, Israel was trying very hard to elicit some Palestinian response by heavy bombing of Lebanon, but they weren't able to do it. And when they finally saw they couldn't do it, they invaded anyway. But it's believed. So even if you take, say, Jimmy Carter's book, much denounced book on peace or apartheid, there's been a massive effort to try to discredit the book by finding a comma misplaced or some other error. But it's very striking that the one serious error in the book has never been mentioned. At least I've never seen it mentioned. The one serious error is his repetition of this fairy tale about how Israel had to defend itself from the rockets. Maybe they overdid it, disproportionate, but understandable. Well, that's the advantage of good propaganda. And it continues. The 2006 invasion, the 5th invasion so far, was very strongly supported by the U.S., relies heavily on the U.S. military, diplomatic, economic support. The bombing of Beirut, for example, or Lebanon was this time is by U.S. planes with Israeli pilots and U.S. bloc ceasefire resolutions and so on. And that continues right now. A particular example is Obama. He's pretty extreme in his support for Israeli terrorism. During the presidential campaign, if you took a look at his website, there's a lot of expressions of his undying love for Israel and so on and so forth. Nothing about the Palestinians, of course. Lebanon's mentioned maybe once, namely when he bragged about having sponsored a resolution in the Senate demanding that nothing be done to limit the Israeli assault on Lebanon until Israel was completely secure from any potential threat by Hezbollah rockets that were launched in response to the massive attack on civilian targets in Lebanon for the 5th time, very destructive. Now, of course, there was a pretext here, too. There always is a pretext for everything. The pretext for the 2006 invasion was that an actual event. Hezbollah had captured 2 Israeli soldiers on the border, and that was taken seriously, which is another interesting illustration of the force of Western propaganda. For decades, Israel has been kidnapping, killing civilians, Lebanese and Palestinians, in Lebanon, on the high seas, hijacking boats, either killing the people or that's piracy, much worse than anything Somalis do, bringing them to Israel, keeping them as imprisoning them without charge, of course, keeping some of them for decades as openly as hostages, no charges, often in secret prisons, which are reported in Israel but not here. This has been going on for decades. But 2 Israeli soldiers are captured at the border, and that justifies a U.S.-Israeli invasion, which kills maybe 1,000 people, destroys much of southern Lebanon, Beirut once again, and so on. Well, that's a comment about us and what we go along with. Well, returning to U.S. support for apartheid, it continued right through the 1980s in violation, in opposition, with all of the growing opposition, even in business circles. In 1988, the Pentagon, Colin Powell's Pentagon, incidentally, declared that the African National Congress was one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. So therefore, the U.S. had to maintain its growing support for the apartheid regime. I should mention in clarification that a year ago, Nelson Mandela was taken off the terrorist list in the United States. So now he can come to the United States without a special dispensation. But in 1988, his African National Congress was one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. Well, at that time, if you look back, the apartheid regime looked absolutely unassailable. Then U.S. policy changed. The exact reasons are not known, but it happened within a year or two. And within a couple of years, the apartheid regime was gone. The South African foreign minister knew exactly what he was talking about. If the Godfather changes his mind, things change. What happened after the end of apartheid is not very beautiful, but there's no doubt that overcoming it was a real victory for peace and justice. Well, there's some lessons there, I think. Virtually without exception, Israeli policies are in fact U.S.-Israeli policies. Israel can go as far as the United States lets it, as far as the United States cooperates with it, and no farther. In fact, Israeli dependence on the United States is far beyond that of apartheid South Africa, which had other support, Britain, international industrialists, and so on. And I think what that means is that if any meaningful change is going to take place with regard to the Palestinians, it's going to have to be based on a change here. I don't see any alternative to that. Well, Israel's very dramatic shift towards a pariah status is very clear, particularly to Israelis, who actually are tending to regard it with kind of exaggerated fear, and in many ways are reacting to it pretty irrationally, even from their own point of view, harming themselves. Just to give you a couple of recent examples in the last few months, Israel went out of its way to humiliate the Turkish ambassador. Turkey's Israel's second most important ally after the United States, and its only regional ally. And what they did was really badly shooting themselves in the foot. Turkey didn't like it, but they let it go by. Second case just happened a week or two ago with our own congressional representative, William Delahunt. He was on a delegation to Israel. He wanted to go see the high officials and so on. Foreign ministry refused to see him. The reason was that the reason that they gave was that he was in a delegation with J Street. J Street is about as centrist as you can get, and insulting J Street is really cutting off a substantial basis of their support in the United States, which they depend on. But that's what they did. And the third is going on right now. It's the Dubai assassination. It's virtually universally assumed that the Mossad carried out the assassination. I mean, the more the details come out, the less convinced I am about that, frankly. I mean, it was done so unprofessionally. You know, I think I could have carried it out more professionally than that. And, you know, intelligence agencies do make mistakes, but anyway, this is getting hard to believe, but it seems to be true. And that is really harming U.S.-Israeli relations with the European countries, Australia and others, especially the stealing of the passports, which gets countries pretty riled up. Actually, another case in point is Israel's reaction to the Goldstone report, which has been wildly exaggerated. In fact, Israel's reaction to the Goldstone report is arousing more antagonism against Israel than the report itself would have if Israel had treated it sensibly, but they're acting pretty irrationally. You can see by taking a look at the UN votes. The Goldstone report called for the UN to take action if Israel and Hamas didn't investigate. And the question of, and it might go all the way up to the International Criminal Court, and it was voted on in November, and the votes were kind of split. It was voted on again this February 26th, and it was quite a substantial change. Just in those few months, the European Union had been split in November. There was nobody voting with Israel in February, either abstaining or voting for the resolution. Britain, France, and Spain shifted and voted for the resolution. Australia, which has been a very strong supporter of Israel, voted against the resolution last November, but abstained this time, and the Australian press interprets it as a reaction to the stealing of the passports. One of them was an Australian passport. The final vote in February, the issue got, I think, 150 words in the New York Times, so if you don't know the details, it's not surprising. But the February vote was, the only support was for the Israeli position, that is voting against the resolution, was the U.S., Israel, Canada, which is even more supportive of Israel than the U.S. is, and then Micronesia, Nauru, Macedonia, and Panama, which isn't a lot to rely on. Well, the hysterical reaction to the Goldstone report is quite striking, particularly so because the Goldstone report gave Israel a free pass. It was favorable to them, very strongly, in fact, and if they'd reacted rationally, they would have used that fact. The Goldstone report restricted itself to crimes committed in the course of the invasion. Now, those, first of all, those, whatever they are, they're minor in comparison with the invasion itself. I mean, the real crime is aggression. So unless you can justify the use of force, if you've used force disproportionately, you know, bad, but not a very serious crime. Furthermore, the crimes committed in the course of the invasion are very hard to prove, no matter when it is or where it is. You know, it's kind of hard to prove that, say, you know, Hitler planned the Holocaust. I mean, nobody doubts it, but you try to give a proof that would hold up in an independent court, it's not so easy. And if you go to particular crimes, you know, like who pushed who into a gas chamber, you know, you're not going to be able to prove it. Crimes carried out in the course of military actions, or this is not military, but especially in wartime conditions, are really hard to prove. So Israel could have easily published a 1,000-page report, which nobody would have read. going over every claim in the Goldstone report and saying, well, you didn't have evidence for this, and you missed that, and so on and so forth. And that would have been it. The real issue is, what was the justification for the U.S.-Israeli invasion in the first place? And the answer is none. There was no justification. There wasn't even a pretext. I mean, there was technically a pretext. It always is. The pretext was that Israel was being bombarded with Hamas rockets. But Israel knew perfectly well, and the United States knew perfectly well, how to stop the Hamas rockets by peaceful means, namely accept a ceasefire. And that would have worked, almost certainly. Now, there had, in fact, been a ceasefire in 2008. And during the ceasefire, Hamas didn't fire a single rocket. You can look up the Israeli government official website to find the recognition of that. And that was true even though Israel didn't live up to the ceasefire. It continued to maintain the siege in violation of the ceasefire agreement. Siege is an act of war, of course. Nevertheless, Hamas didn't fire any rockets. On November 4th, under the cover of the U.S. elections, Israel invaded Gaza, killed half a dozen Hamas militants, and then rocket fire started. And there was an exchange in which everybody killed was Palestinian, as usual. The Hamas called for a reinstatement of the ceasefire. The Israeli this went right up to practically the day of the invasion. The Israeli cabinet considered it, we know from internal Israeli sources, and decided not to do it. They wanted to attack. Of course, the U.S. is up to its neck in this. So the U.S. and Israel knew perfectly well that there were peaceful means to stop the rocket fire, which was the alleged pretext, but preferred not to use them, just as in other cases that I mentioned. There are peaceful means. You don't want to use them. In that case, you have no justification for the use of force. I mean, both in just normal common sense and also in its straight international law. The resort to force is completely banned. It's the worst crime, unless you have exhausted peaceful means and a couple of other conditions. And in this case, the U.S. and Israel refused even to try peaceful means because they knew they were going to work. So the justification for the invasion is zero. In fact, if they fired one pistol shot, it was a crime. And hence, looking into the difficult question of disproportionality is a straight gift to Israel. And Goldstone himself wrote the mandate for the investigation, and he wrote it this way. He wrote it so as to exclude the crucial issue. Was there any justification for the use of force in the first place? And he's explained why. He's explained that, in his opinion, Israel has every right to use force, no matter what. So that question didn't arise. So as I say, the Goldstone report is a free pass for Israel. It's a gift. But their reaction to it has been so irrational and hysterical that it's actually stirred up a lot of opposition around the world. Well, that's those who've followed history of apartheid will recognize similarities. Just can't be perceived here. What about the dependence I've mentioned a couple of times, of Israel and the United States, considerably more extreme than that of South Africa on the United States? That dates back, you can trace it back. It dates back to 1971, when Israel made a fateful decision, I think the most fateful decision in its history. In 1971, Israel had a choice, straight choice: complete security or expansion into the territories it had conquered. The choice was given by the president of Egypt, President Sadat. In February 1971, through a negotiator, he offered Israel a full peace treaty. Egypt is the only significant military force in the Arab world. If Israel had a full peace treaty with Egypt, okay, there's no international conflict anymore. At that time, there was virtually no PLO action. Sadat's offer to Israel offered nothing to the Palestinians. Palestinians' rights weren't even on the international agenda then. So they had an offer, nothing for the Palestinians, full peace treaty in return for withdrawal from the occupied territories. And Egypt didn't really care about anything except the Sinai. Egyptian territory, added the rest, but didn't care. For what it's worth, Jordan the next year made the same offer with regard to the West Bank. So there was a choice, full security or expansion. Expansion at that time was primarily into the Sinai, where Israel, this is a labor government, the dovish government, Israel was implementing plans to drive out thousands of Bedouin farmers from the northeast Sinai, build a big city there, city of Yamit, which was going to be an all-Jewish city, 1 million people, a lot of settlements, kibbutzim and so on. And Egypt made it very clear that if they're going to keep doing that, there's going to be a war. Nobody took it seriously, but Israel decided to reject the offer. Said straight out, we're not going to accept it. Okay, they decided then on expansion over security. Now the big question is, what's the Godfather going to say? And it wasn't very clear at that time. The U.S. was still sort of part of the world on this issue. There was a conflict inside the Washington bureaucracy. There was a conflict between William Rogers, the Secretary of State, who wanted to accept the offer. It's pretty much in line with his own policies, and Henry Kissinger, who was the National Security Advisor. And if you look over his record, his main enemy in the world was the State Department. Russia was far down the list. He wanted to take over the State Department and be the one honcho in charge. So if William Rogers said it's raining, Kissinger would argue that the sun's out. Since Rogers was in favor of it, Kissinger came out against it. He argued for what he called stalemate. The arguments he gave are so ludicrous it's embarrassing to report them, but that's often true about Kissinger if you look at his really strange character. But in any event, he insisted on stalemate. Nixon went along with Kissinger. Rejection of the offer. Stalemate means no diplomacy, just force. And he's pretty frank about it. I mean, he says it straight out in his memoirs. Well, okay, that set the tone for what followed. I won't run through what followed, but it's been pretty much that ever since. And that means that Israel is heavily reliant, in fact, completely reliant on the Godfather, even more so than South Africa, because once you accept that you're not going to accept, that security is low down, you're going to insist on expansion, then you're in trouble. You have to be pretty careful, and you have to accept the hope of the South African ambassador that the only vote, foreign minister, that the only vote that counts will stay with you. So far that's been mostly true. There have been exceptions. In fact, one striking exception, very informative one, was in January 2001. That's the one time in the past 35 years, roughly, that the U.S. has joined the world. There's an overwhelming international consensus. It includes everybody except the U.S. and Israel on a two-state settlement on the international border, maybe some modifications. There's one time when the U.S. went along with that, or at least didn't oppose it. In January 2001, Clinton's last term, he set forth what he called his parameters, a little vague, but more or less in line with the international consensus. He reported publicly that both sides, Israel and the Palestinians, had accepted his parameters. Both sides had reservations. They met in Egypt, in Taba, Egypt, to try to iron out their differences, and they came pretty close to a settlement. In fact, at the end of the negotiations, they had a press conference in which they said that with a little more time they could have settled everything. Well, Israel pulled out of the negotiations at that point, so it ended there. But what it illustrates is that if an American president is willing to tolerate a diplomatic settlement, it may very well be reachable. Well, lots happened since 2001, but nothing to change this, I don't think. In fact, in a deeper sense, nothing to change the position expressed by the South African foreign minister. Well, what are the just to finish up, what are the options for the Palestinians now? One option is clear. The United States can change its position and join the world. insist on some version of the international consensus, maybe something like what was virtually reached in Taba, and that's one outcome. It's commonly argued, in fact, across the board it's argued, that that's impossible. Well, if it's impossible, there's nothing left for the Palestinians. But it's argued that there's another alternative, namely Israel will take over the entire West Bank, and then there'll be a civil rights struggle, an anti-apartheid struggle, and Israel will be facing a demographic problem, what's called a demographic problem, too many Palestinians in what's supposed to be a Jewish state. And in fact, that's commonly argued now to be by advocates of the Palestinians, including Palestinians themselves, to be preferable to a two-state settlement. Well, and Israeli doves like Meron Ben-Veniste argue this too. It's a very bad reasoning because it doesn't recognize that those are not the two alternatives. There's a third alternative, namely the U.S. and Israel can do exactly what they're doing now. What they're doing now is a very systematic policy, very well planned, carefully executed, which even has a name. It was called by Ehud Olmert Convergence, later expanded to Convergence Plus. The plan is take what's valuable, the land inside the annexation wall, Greater Jerusalem, the corridors that cut through and break things up into the cantons, take over the Jordan Valley, imprison what's left, and leave the rest to rot. Don't take responsibility for them. No demographic problem. They're not part of any Israeli jurisdiction. They're like the Bantustans, independent, totally independent. And they can follow Moshe Dayan's prescription. Live like dogs, and whoever leaves can leave. And for the Palestinian bourgeoisie, maybe enlightened Israelis will follow the prescriptions of South African apartheid leaders and give them jobs, indigenize the repression apparatus and so on, kind of like the Bantustans. Hasn't happened yet, but it could. No demographic problem, no Palestinians for Israel to worry about, no apartheid struggle, no civil rights struggle, and it's not an idealized abstraction. That's what's happening before our eyes. To omit the alternative that is in fact being implemented is really blindness. So the options, as far as I can see, are a two-state settlement or implementation of what's happening. Well, there's only one. This means, if what I've said is accurate, that pretty much everything turns on a change in U.S. policies. And in the current world order, it's pretty hard to see what could induce a change in U.S. policies, except actions taken within the United States. And nobody else has the power to influence U.S. policies, which is in a way a kind of an optimistic conclusion for those of us who oppose these policies, because what goes on inside the United States is the one thing we can really hope to influence. Hard, but possible. What goes on elsewhere is almost impossible to influence. So I think it's an optimistic conclusion. It means a lot of hard work, but pretty clear work, and I think I think the implications for tactical choices should be pretty obvious. Thanks.
Okay, before we move into Q&A, there's just a few announcements that we're going to give. And then there are mic stands, which are going to be moved. There's going to be one over there, and there's going to be one on top. And I will recognize people before they speak. First of all, I just want to say that this event was put on by Students for Justice in Palestine at Boston University. With the exception of this Monday, because of spring break, we meet every Monday in CAS, the College of Arts and Sciences, room 425, and you can go there to learn more about what we do and how we're actually going to fight for Palestinian justice. There's several other things happening that are important, and there's people that are outside that'll have more information. But on March 4th, there's going to be a teach-in at UMass Boston to defend public education. That's going to be 4 o'clock, and there's information outside. It's going to be at the McCormick Building. There's also going to be a large anti-war protest in D.C. against Afghanistan and Iraq, the current occupations. There's a bus leaving from Boston late on the 19th and returning on the 20th, and you can contact Answer Coalition. And the last announcement, hold on one second, that I have right now, is there's going to be a teach-in at Northeastern University on March 21st. You can look on Facebook for that. There's several other announcements of things that are going on. Our Apartheid Week isn't ending today. We're having one more event tomorrow, which is Occupation 101. You could check on our Facebook group for that. I'm going to open it up now to Q&A. We got a mic up there too, but I guess we're going to start with up top, and then we'll go down and up and down. So up at the top first. Go ahead. And sorry, one more thing. Just make sure that your questions are brief, because we have a lot of people that want to ask questions and not a lot of time. So thank you.
Thank you. Professor Chomsky, the Israeli government, you suggested, used disproportionate force and also did not want to take the road of peace with the Palestinians. Whereas, as I recall, in 2000 in the Camp David Accords...
Clearly I'm not hearing. Try again.
As you suggested, you implied that Israel used disproportionate force, that they are not a country who is seeking peace, and also that should they engage in a ceasefire with Hamas and Gaza, that such a thing would bring about peace. Whereas the Israeli government has offered peace and concessions that were far beyond the desires of their own people, such as at Camp David in 2000 when Arafat rejected the ability to have peace, to have two separately coexisting peoples, spurring the Second Intifada, which was a mass of suicide bombings that were indiscriminate and killed innocent civilians. And at the same time, Olmert pulled out of Gush Katif in the summer of 2005, resulting in the firing of rockets indiscriminately and purposefully on civilian populations, whereas during Operation Cast Lead, Israel dropped thousands of leaflets, made thousands of phone calls, sent text messages to each and every one of the buildings that they were targeting. And
I'm sorry, is this a question?
And so my question is to you, with all of these concessions, with Israel providing peace and trying to engage in peace, who here really values life? Who tries to protect life by telling civilians to get away? And who uses them as human shields?
Okay, I think we get the point. We can count up the Israeli concessions. The total number is 0. In 2001, which you mentioned, we know what happened. There's plenty of Israeli sources, if you can read Hebrew, that are even more detailed, but even in English. As I mentioned, there were negotiations. They were coming pretty close to an agreement. The last press conference said, a little more time, we can have an agreement. At that point, Israel pulled out. Arafat didn't pull out. Israel pulled out, and the negotiations terminated. That was 2001. In 2005, Israel withdrew 7,000 settlers or so from the Gaza Strip. They had been protected by like half the Israeli army, and they were taking 40% of the land, and it was almost indefensible. It was totally crazy. So what they did was pretty sensible. They took them out of the Gaza Strip, and they put them in the West Bank illegally. But Israel never relaxed its control over the Gaza Strip. I mean, it maintained its occupation. In fact, sorry? I don't know what you're saying. I can't hear you. Can I continue? By June 2006, that's about 6 months after the withdrawal, Israel had already fired about 7,700 rockets into the Gaza Strip. It maintained the controls. It maintained the border controls. It maintained the siege. A major event took place in January 2006, about 2 months after the withdrawal. There was an election in Palestine. It was a free election. It was internationally monitored. Everyone said free and fair. The only trouble was it came out the wrong way. Hamas won the election. The U.S. and Israel instantly turned to harsh punishment of the Palestinians for voting the wrong way in a free election. And that was reported in the front page of the newspaper. It wasn't concealed. You know, it's perfectly obvious. And furthermore, was accepted. I mean, obviously we punish people if they vote the wrong way in a free election. That was going on particularly in Gaza. I mean, the Israeli attacks just increased through early 2006. And they got much worse later, but we don't have to go into that. As for the leaflets, yeah, that's correct. When the U.S. and Israel carried out an unprovoked act of aggression against Gaza, which is a major war crime, then yes, they dropped leaflets a couple of minutes before they were going to bomb somebody's house. Like, okay, let's all applaud. The crucial, I'm sure we'd be happy if, say, Iran started bombing our homes, but dropped a few leaflets in advance. The crucial issue, I'm afraid you evaded. The crucial issue is what decision the U.S. and Israel made on December 28th, 2008. They had a decision. Should they accept a ceasefire, which they knew was going to work, because it had worked until Israel violated it, there's no reason to see any change, which would have ended the pretext for invasion, or should they instead invade? Okay, we know what they decided. They decided to invade. Okay, that's a pure act of aggression. The Nuremberg trials called the supreme international crime, encompassing all the crimes that follow. That means it's not even necessary to investigate the disproportionate force. Well, as I mentioned, the Goldstone report gave Israel a free pass on this. It refused to look at the crucial issue. And it's very interesting that almost nobody in the United States, and as far as I know, Britain, or what I've seen of Europe, this just can't be discussed. It's an amazing illustration of the extraordinary force of U.S. propaganda. People can't even see how ludicrous it is. I mean, here's an easy way to solve a claimed problem without the use of force, but we refuse because we want to attack. And then comes a debate about whether during the attack the force was disproportionate. You can't imagine a free pass beyond that.
All right, next question, and please keep it brief and questions.
Okay, well, the only non-question part I want to thank Professor Chomsky and appreciate. I think audience members hopefully enjoy his talk as much as their grandparents did. I actually share something with Professor Chomsky in that I'm older than probably most of the people in the audience. Yeah. And
we can skip the insults.
It's a two-part. I grew up at a time when the South African apartheid anti-apartheid movement was live in colleges, and I guess one question is, in contrast to that, why the current BDS movement seems to be so deeply involved with not actually genuine successes, but hoaxes, like Hampshire College, and of course I can mention others that are clear hoaxes, TIA-CREF, BlackRock, virtually all the things claimed last year as successful BDS were hoaxes.
I'm sorry, I lost you.
Well, I guess the
what
question
does
is,
TIA-CREF have to do with
well, these are all boycott, divestment, and sanction, quote-unquote successes, BDS, boycott, divestment, sanction, the point of this meeting, that just turned out to be frauds.
Do you have a question?
And yeah, so I'd like you to compare and contrast the South African apartheid movement involving genuine divestment with the current one that seems to involve fraudulent. And also, just because you mentioned J Street, I just want your reaction to their comment today that, quote, "We strongly oppose Israel Apartheid Week." This is J Street speaking, because we believe it employs inflammatory, inaccurate language, misrepresentation of the complex truth of the conflict, undercuts debate, alienates significant numbers of students, and advances the agenda of the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement. This is the group you mentioned represents center.
Is there anybody here who hears a question? I don't hear it. Yeah. In fact, or even a comment that's relevant to anything that was discussed? Yeah. I mean, I understand your emotions, but I don't understand anything beyond that, I'm afraid. What does any of this have to do with what we're discussing?
Well, I had a question mark at the end. Does today's divestment movement, with its reliance on hoaxes such as Hampshire, really bear any resemblance to the divestment movement in South Africa?
Okay, so does the Hampshire divestment proposal...
Rod.
Does the Hampshire divestment proposal with regard to Israel have any resemblance to their divestment proposal with regard to South Africa? Is that the question?
Yes.
Well, the answer is that with regard to Israel, it's much more mild, so it's not the same. With regard to South Africa, if you go back to 1977, Hampshire called on U.S. corporations to divest from South Africa. They didn't call for that in the Israel case. What they called for the university, in this case, to divest from corporations that are involved in criminal actions in the occupied territories. Okay, they asked U.S. corporations to obey the law. And those actions are criminal. There's no debate about this. I mean, back in 1967, Israel's leading legal authorities, its Attorney General, Theodore Meron, who was the legal authority for the state, a very distinguished international lawyer. He's on all the international tribunals and so on. They all informed the Israeli government that any settlement activities in the occupied territories are in violation of core principles of international law. And Moshe Dayan, who was, as I mentioned, defense minister in charge of the territories, he listened. He said, yeah, you're right. It's all in violation of international law. But countries violate international law, and we're going to do it anyway. And in fact, as long as you have the Godfather on your side, who violates international law all the time, why not? But the question of illegality is not at issue. And the Hampshire petition, in this case, simply asked the university to keep to the law, not invest in corporations that are carrying out actions in the occupied territories. That's much milder than their divestment petition with regard to South Africa. So you're right, they're not exactly the same. Like the Goldstone report, they're not a free pass, but they're saying we're not going to support illegal actions.
Professor Chomsky, what would you say about the position of U.S. universities and U.S. academics on this issue compared to, say, 10 to 20 years ago, especially considering what happened to professors like Norman Finkelstein?
Sorry, I can't hear. Can you hear?
Yeah. What would you say about the position of U.S. universities and U.S. academics on this issue compared to, say, 10 to 20 years ago, especially considering what happened to professors like Norman Finkelstein?
I'm sorry, I don't understand. What about Norman Finkelstein?
He's asking what was the position, how does the position change between professors and academics nowadays in regards to how they were 20 years ago on this issue?
On this issue?
Yeah.
Well, on this issue, it was almost not discussable 20 years ago. I mean, I can tell you my own experience. If I was giving talks on this issue at my own college, MIT, there'd have to be police protection, and the meetings would be broken up, literally broken up by students organized, to prevent discussion. 20 years ago, when you mentioned, I happened to be going to UCLA for a week of talks on the philosophy department. Well, when I go anywhere, I always give political talks. The big issue at that time was Central America, so I was asked to give lots of talks about Central America. But one faculty member, a tenured faculty member, who incidentally spent half the year teaching in Tel Aviv University, asked me if I'd give a talk on the Middle East. So I said, sure, I'd give a talk on the Middle East. And he announced it. One day later, I got a call from the campus police saying that they wanted to have uniformed police with me every moment that I was on campus, giving a philosophy seminar or walking from the faculty club to the seminar room. So they asked would I agree. I said, no, I wouldn't agree. So they had undercover police every minute. It's not hard to detect, believe me. But every minute on campus, I was followed by undercover police. They did allow the talk at on the campus. And by then there was enough of an uproar about it, so they had to get the biggest auditorium on campus. And it was under airport security. There was one entrance. Everybody who walked into that entrance, hundreds of people, had to be searched, handbag searched, every bag, you couldn't take in a bag and so on. We sort of had the meeting. As soon as I left the campus, the barrage started. It always starts after you leave, so you can't answer. That's a well-known tactic. All kind of hysterical denunciations, the usual business, you're supporting terror, who knows what. The professor in question, who I repeat was teaching 6 months a year at Tel Aviv, there was a campaign on campus to take away his tenure. Okay, that was 20 years ago. Things have changed. They've changed a lot. Now you can have sensible discussions of this topic on campus. And in fact, now it's turned to something like the opposite, so that it's pretty hard usually to even elicit a hostile question. What you're just hearing is pretty unusual. Usually there's just no support for a U.S.-Israeli policy. That's a big change. And it means that the U.S. policy could be changed, as it was in South Africa. With regard to South Africa, there was very little protest in many of the worst years, even after Sharpeville. It built up over the years. By around 1980, it had gotten pretty substantial, but that's after many years. And the Reaganite support for South African atrocities in the 1980s, which was horrible, has yet to be protested. Nobody, to my knowledge, has protested the fact that Reagan supported South African forces while they were killing over 1 million people in Angola and Mozambique. I haven't heard anyone protest the fact that Colin Powell's Pentagon, he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, condemned the African National Congress as one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world in 1988. Have you heard anybody protest that? I mean, you can learn these things from, scholarly sources and stuff, but it's just not part of the discussion, even to this day. So yeah, it takes a long time before things break through.
Professor Chomsky, thank you for coming. It's an honor to have you here. My question is, can you throw light on why the drafters of the 1951 Refugee Convention and the subsequent 67 Protocol decided to leave out Palestinians out of the official definition of refugees, and also what can be done to improve UNRWA's mandate to administer assistance and protect?
Yeah, could you speak it louder, clearer, and slower?
Oh.
Maybe if you move back away from the mic a little clearer. I'm just not hearing, I'm sorry.
Okay, Professor Chomsky, can you throw some light on why the drafters of the 1951 Refugee Convention and the subsequent 67 Protocol decided...
67 what?
Protocol.
Protocol.
Yes. Why did the drafters leave out Palestinians out of the official definition for refugees? And also...
I understand. The Palestinians, in fact, are the only... I mean, they're maybe one of the biggest refugee problems in the world, but they're the only one that's not considered refugees to this day. I mean, the Palestinian refugees are under the jurisdiction of the UNRWA. They don't fall under refugee rights. Okay? Why is this the case? Well, the Western powers, especially the United States, didn't give a damn. I mean, in fact, in the early days, if you look back in 1950, 1951, the United States was softly insisting that Israel do something with regard to the refugees that allow them to return. But it wasn't much. There was some pressure, but not much. And after that, it just dropped off the radar screen. After 1967, when the U.S.-Israeli relation was established in its present form, the issue is just gone. The U.S. simply supports Israel on this as everything else. But your point is right. It's the one maybe, I think the only major refugee population that is not treated as falling under the refugee conventions.
You up there?
Hello, thank you. I'm sick, apparently. I'm the son of an Israeli, and I'd like to find out as much about this situation as I can. And from what I recently read, you said that Israel has reacted hysterically to the Goldstone reports.
That's right.
What I read is that they, in fact, they did respond to it. They filed a report. You say, be it 1,000 pages or so, ever, no one's going to read it. What I also read was that Hamas has not filed a report, and what do you have to say about that?
Actually, Hamas also gave a report. I'm not talking about the fact that they did, in fact, submit first a 60-page report and then a much longer report. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the general reaction. The general reaction is one of remarkable hysteria. I don't know if you read the Israeli press or see what goes on there, but it's unbelievable. And the reaction has, in fact, caused much more hostility, as I described. If they had simply said, fine, thank you for the free pass, we're now going to talk about the details of whether, there was a firefight nearby when a stray missile attacked the source of all of the flour in Gaza. If they'd restricted themselves to that, it's always a weak case. Any discussion of war crimes in practice is always a weak case. You weren't there, you didn't see maybe something else happen. If they'd simply kept quietly to that, I think the whole thing would have died. Instead, they turned into a huge issue. I mean, it's considered like a lethal problem in Israel. It's a major problem, the Goldstone report. And Goldstone himself has been defamed beyond discussion. It's incredible in Israel, but also in the United States. And I think that hysterical reaction has been counterproductive for their own purposes, especially because the Goldstone report did give them a free pass. And that's the important thing.
Good evening, Noam. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Who's talking?
Myself.
You.
Good evening, Noam. I'd like to thank you for an excellent talk tonight. And I know you were in Ireland recently, and I hope you had a wonderful, some Irish hospitality when you went to Belfast. My question for you is, I'd like to address the idea if the United States government were to impose some sort of settlement on Israel, a two-state solution. Israel, as is known, well, it's best kept secret in town, has nuclear weapons. And given the irrational and racist nature of the Israeli state, do you see any dangers inherent that there would be a lobby that would, take it all with them? It's our biblical promise having this state. Would they use those nuclear weapons? And how do we get rid of them?
So I didn't hear most.
Yeah.
Let me repeat and see if I got the gist of it. If the United States simply joined the world and said, okay, we're going to agree with the rest of the world that there should be a two-state settlement, and Israel didn't want to go along, could they use their nuclear weapons?
Well, yes. Would Israel and could they use their nuclear weapons? Do you think that's a serious concern?
It's not a minor question. If you go back over the record, back in the 1950s, way before they had nuclear weapons, we know a lot about the internal discussions in Israel because of the diary. Many volumes of diaries were published of Moshe Shertok, the foreign minister, who was in and out. And there's a lot of stuff in there about this. Back in the mid-50s, Israeli leaders, these are the doves, incidentally, were taking the position that if we're pressed too far, we will go crazy, nishtagea. We'll go crazy if we're pushed too far, and we'll make them pay for it. So they better leave us alone. Well, they were talking about the United States mainly. Well, they couldn't do anything about it at that time. But once they have nuclear weapons, it's not a joke. And U.S. planners have been concerned about it. You can read in military journals, U.S. military journals, I've quoted them now and then, concerned that Israeli nuclear weapons could be a threat to the United States. I mean, not that they're going to attack the United States, but that they could cause some big problem for the United States. When Israel announced some years back that it had the capacity to deliver nuclear weapons to southern Russia, the United States got upset. because that's the threat they're worried about. Yeah, they're what's called a crazy state in international relations discourse. There's a technical term, crazy state. And and they've said, yeah, we can be a crazy state. In fact, there's even a name for it in Israel. It's called the Samson complex. Remember, if you read the Bible, that the first suicide bomber, who is highly honored, incidentally, was Samson. Samson, you know the whole story about his hair and Delilah and everything, but at the end, he was blinded, he was a captive of the Philippines, and he got his hair grew back, he got his strength back. And the story ends with Samson standing in a temple with lots and lots of Philistines around, and he's standing between two columns, and he pulls the columns down, of course commits suicide, but he killed a lot of Philistines, and the text says very proudly, he killed more Philistines in his death than in his lifetime. So if you want, he's the first suicide bomber. And the Samson complex, what it means is... pardon?
Don't worry about it.
Can't hear. I'm sorry, I can't hear. I can't hear. But what's called in Israel the Samson complex, and internationally too, is exactly what you're talking about. The possibility that they might just decide to commit suicide and bring down a lot of the rest of the world with them. I don't think it's very likely, frankly, but it's a possibility, and it's been a concern of U.S. planners. The way to overcome that concern is very straightforward. Another case where the United States could join the world. And in this case, the world even includes the American population. There's much concern, I don't have to tell you, about the alleged threat that Iran poses. So Iran might develop nuclear weapons and all kind of horrible things will happen. Well, there's a sensible way to deal with that, a very sensible way, namely to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Okay, have a nuclear weapons-free zone with verification procedures, which is perfectly possible. Then that would be the end of Iranian nuclear weapons, it would be the end of Israeli nuclear weapons. It would mean that U.S. forces in the region can't deploy nuclear weapons. Okay? Practically the whole world is in favor of this. The American population is strongly in favor of it. The U.S. and Britain are committed to it more than any other countries, for a simple reason, which is right in front of your eyes, but nobody's willing to talk about. When the U.S. and Britain invaded Iraq, they tried to construct a kind of a thin legal cover for it. It was so thin, nobody paid much attention. But they tried, at least. And the legal cover invoked a Security Council resolution, Security Council Resolution 687 in 1991, which called on Iraq to dismantle its weapons of mass destruction. And the U.S. and Britain claimed, well, they hadn't done it, so we can invade because the resolution is still in force. As I say, nobody paid much attention, but they did invoke that. Well, if you bother to read UN 687, which is easy enough, look it up on the internet, Article 14 commits the signers to moving towards establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. Okay? That's the U.S. and Israel, the only countries that invoke that resolution. In fact, recently invoked it. So yeah, they have a special commitment to do it. And that would alleviate, maybe end these problems. But that's another case where you've got to get the godfather to change his position. Incidentally, it's not just here. I mean, Obama talks about how he wants to get rid of nuclear weapons. Okay, talk's easy. There are ways to proceed. Ways to proceed, for example, are by establishing nuclear weapons-free zones around the world. It doesn't deal with everything, but it's a step, maybe the most important step. And there has been some progress on that with a constant impediment from Washington still continuing. Let me tell you where it stands, if you're interested in nuclear weapons and proliferation, or maybe survival for another couple of years. Just a couple of months ago, there was a nuclear weapons-free zone established in Africa. There was a lot of debate and negotiation, but finally the African Union did agree to have a nuclear weapons-free zone. one problem. Britain and the United States don't agree. Well, which ends it. They don't agree because there's an island, Diego Garcia, which is part of Mauritius, a state in the African Union, and Britain, under orders from the master, it was a British colony, kicked out all the population, sent them go rot somewhere else, because the United States wanted to build a big military base there. Well, that military base uses nuclear weapons, and in fact, the U.S. nuclear submarines are deployed there. And it's not academic. That's one of the major bases that the United States and Britain use to bomb the Middle East and Central Asia. Yeah, it's bombing from Diego Garcia. So they don't want this base to be free of nuclear weapons, and therefore they've blocked the African Union zone. In fact, just last December, the Navy Department announced that they're sending a submarine tender to Diego Garcia to service nuclear submarines. Okay? This is pretty serious stuff. These are not abstract, I mean, these are actual bombings going on in front of our noses, and they have nuclear weapons there. Okay, that's that nuclear weapons-free zone. There was another one established in the Pacific. There is a Pacific nuclear weapons-free zone. That goes back much farther, about 1985. The French refused to accept it because they wanted to use French islands for nuclear weapons tests. Okay, finally they carried out their nuclear weapons tests and they accept it. The United States doesn't accept it because those Pacific islands, you know, the ones that vote with the United States alone in UN declarations, those are U.S. military bases which store nuclear weapons, and U.S. nuclear submarines pass right through there. So that one's scotched. And the Middle East, the most important would be the Middle East zone, but that isn't even on the agenda. But it answers exactly to the questions that whoever it was raised. It would also have the side effect of eliminating whatever the Iranian threat is supposed to be. But that's just not on the agenda. It's our problem.
Do you see any sign that the Obama administration might take a harder line with Israel? I'm thinking particularly of the rift that seems to have developed over the issue of settlement freezes between the Netanyahu government and the Obama administration. Might this augur a change in official American policy or an amelioration of the situation?
Might the stand of the Obama administration augur a change in U.S. policy?
Yeah.
Nothing that I can see. Obama has been very explicit about not changing U.S. policy a whit, taking a very strong position on this. I mean, he did make one statement that, you know, everybody hails and Israel is very worried about. He said that Israel should stop expanding settlements. I mean, that's nothing. He was quoting Bush. Yeah, Bush said the same thing. In fact, he was quoting the famous roadmap. In fact, he used the actual words of the roadmap. There is a theoretical agreement called the roadmap by the quartet, the United States, UN, Russia, and Europe. That's supposed to be the plan for peace. It says Israel must stop any settlement expansion, even for natural growth. So yeah, Obama quoted it. That amounts to zero. He also quoted it with a wink. He said, I'm not going to do anything about it. He was quite explicit about that. He was asked, in fact, one of his spokesmen was asked in a press conference, are you going to take any action in case Israel proceeds to expand? Not a very dramatic move. George Bush #1 did take some action, you know, kind of a mild tap on the wrist, but he did something as punishment for expansion. Obama said, no, we're not going to do what Bush did. This is purely symbolic. Okay, that's a way of telling Netanyahu, don't worry about it. I'm just repeating what we all know to be vacuous. Furthermore, the whole issue of settlement expansion it's a diversion. I mean, the issue isn't expansion of illegal settlements, it's their existence. You know, and the policies that I described, the convergence policies. So if you worry about the expansion of illegal settlements, I mean, even if you were to stop it, it wouldn't mean anything. And Netanyahu understands he doesn't have to stop it. On other issues, Obama has been quite clear in saying that he does not mean a word he's saying about a two-state settlement. The point at which he made this most explicit was in his, in fact, one and only major speech about the Middle East, about the Israel-Palestine issue. Shortly after coming into office, he announced the appointment of George Mitchell as a negotiator, and he said, he's very forthcoming, tells everyone he loves them. So he was telling the Arab states, we love you. And he was saying, well, there is a constructive proposal on the table, namely the Arab state proposal. And then he said, we ought to really take that seriously. And then he addressed the Arab states, and he said, you ought to live up to your proposal and start normalizing relations with Israel. Well, he's an intelligent, literate person. He knows perfectly well that's not what the proposal says. The proposal calls for a two-state settlement in terms of the international consensus, and then goes on and says, well, once we're moving on that, then after that we'll move towards normalization. So what Obama was saying is, you proceed with the corollary to your proposal, but we're not paying attention to the core of it. I mean, you could hardly say more strictly that we're going to continue our rejectionist policies. And so it's continued. I mean, there are a lot of... Obama has a good PR system. There's no doubt about it. He's managed to create lots of illusions. In fact, as you may know, his campaign won the award from the advertising industry for the best marketing campaign of 2008. And it was merited. But, try to find some substance to it, almost in anything. A few things here and there. But on this, it's been pretty straight. You can't accuse him of misleading anyone. So I don't see anything. I never saw, and now see even less, any reason to expect any change in his administration, except maybe for the worse.
Hi, you mentioned how, sorry, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear, but I can't make out what you're saying.
Okay, so you mentioned how, you mentioned how Israel rejected Egypt's offer for peace in 1971, and yet you failed to mention that 7 years later, Israel, in fact, did make drastic concessions with Egypt, leading to a peace treaty.
Sorry, Israel what?
Made drastic concessions to Egypt, which indeed did lead to a peace treaty.
In 1978.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit how...
Yeah, that's a very interesting story. I'll talk about that.
Okay, so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit how mentioning the unsuccessful peace agreement but not mentioning the peace agreement differs from propaganda.
Just shortage of time. When I've written about it, I always talk about it because it's very revealing. What happened is, I'm afraid you're not going to like the answer because the facts aren't pleasant, but here's what happened. In 1971, the U.S. and Israel rejected Sadat's offer. Sadat was very explicit. He said, if you build Yamit, if you continue to settle in the Sinai, that's going to mean war. Israel and the United States just laughed. It was a very racist period in Israel. Actually, a very good book on this. Unfortunately, it's only in French and Hebrew. I couldn't get an English publisher for it. Amnon Kapeliuk, who's one of the best Israeli correspondents, wrote a book about it, which is very revealing. He's describing the kind of the atmosphere in Israel from roughly the early 70s. It was extremely racist. It was, the Arabs don't know which end of the gun to hold. I mean, we don't care what Egypt says. We'll disregard them. It was the same here. That's why Kissinger didn't lift a finger when Sadat made repeated moves, like expelling Russian advisors and so on, to say, look, I really mean this peace offer. Kissinger just disregarded it. What do the Arabs know? They can't fire guns. In fact, Israel didn't even try to defend the Bar-Lev line. They had a defense line on the Suez Canal. And they saw, you couldn't miss seeing that there were big Egyptian mobilizations on the other side of the canal, but they basically laughed. I think they left maybe 600 men there or something like that. Well, it turned out that it wasn't a joke. Egypt invaded, Syria invaded. They didn't intend to go very far. In fact, they were surprised by how little resistance they met. And it ended up being a near catastrophe for Israel, the worst period of their history. They were almost destroyed. They just barely pulled it out at the end with a lot of U.S. aid. Okay, that sent a shaft of light through planners in Israel and the United States. Even Kissinger understood now. He doesn't understand much, to say the truth, but he does understand force. And this lifted the clouds. At that point, the question is, how do we resurrect it? And what Kissinger started to do after '73 was what was called shuttle diplomacy. The great negotiator flew up and back from this place to that place, and I won't go through the details, but finally in 1978, they got together in Camp David. No Kissinger anymore, it was Carter. And they basically agreed on what Sadat had offered in 1971. From Israel's point of view, it was a worse offer, because by the mid-'70s, the Palestinian issue had gotten onto the agenda, and Egypt insisted on something for the Palestinians. But they really had no choice. Once they realized that Egypt isn't a basket case, you can't just disregard them and ridicule them, they had to go to a fallback position. Was, okay, let's accept something like the 1971 offer that we rejected. Had to be dragged kicking and screaming to do it, but there was absolutely no choice. This is regarded if you look at U.S., you take a course in U.S. history or something, they'll tell you this is a tremendous diplomatic triumph for the United States. It was a diplomatic catastrophe. They rejected an offer in 1971 that could have prevented a major war, a lot of suffering, a lot of danger. And finally, they were sort of forced to accept it. That's a diplomatic triumph. It's a diplomatic catastrophe. So sure, I'm happy to talk about it, just like I've written about it.
What exactly are the forces and the institutions that inspired the what exactly are the institutions and the forces that inspired the United States decisions on this issue?
Can't hear. Can you hear?
What inspired what forces and institutions, what forces and institutions inspired the United States position on this issue?
Oh, I see. So what inspires the U.S. position on this issue?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's pretty straightforward. Basically what happened, I'll cut a lot of corners, until 1967, U.S. relations with Israel were, friendly, but it was nothing like it is today. In fact, in 1958, right at the most sensitive moment, middle of an election, Eisenhower forced Israel out of the Sinai. He said, you guys are going to get out of the Sinai or else, and they had to withdraw. It was a big blow to Israel. But relations were more or less tolerable, not great. Israel was getting most of its arms from France, in fact. In '67, Israel performed a major service to the United States. There was a conflict going on in the Arab world between secular nationalism and radical fundamentalism. And the U.S., of course, supported radical fundamentalism against secular nationalism, which was regarded as the main threat. That was pretty straight. Secular nationalism meant Egypt. Radical fundamentalism meant Saudi Arabia, where all the oil is. There was actually a war going on between Saudi Arabia and Egypt at the time in the Yemen. Israel destroyed the main center of secular Arab nationalism. That was a tremendous gift to the United States and to its Saudi Arabian radical Islamist allies. And that's when the relationship got established in its current form. That's also when, in the United States, a love affair began among intellectuals with Israel. Before that, there was not very much interest in Israel, even in the Jewish journals, like commentary, it was not very significant. But after '67, it's been a real love affair. I mean, they perform a major service to U.S. power, wonderful. In 1970, it increased. In 1970, the Jordanian dictatorship, close U.S. ally, was crushing Palestinian resistance, killing a lot of Palestinians. it looked for a while as if Syria might intervene to protect the Palestinians. The U.S. didn't want that. They regarded it as a threat to the Hashemite king, the Jordanian kingdom, and to the Saudi monarchy. But the U.S. was all tied up in Southeast Asia at the time. They couldn't do anything. So Israel mobilized the Air Force and so on, and made it pretty clear to Syria that if they try to move, Israel was going to smash them. So they backed off. Well, that was another big gift. And in fact, U.S. aid to Israel quadrupled at that time. If you go back to read U.S. intelligence reports from that period, they're pretty straight. They said our mode of control of Middle East oil, which is of course what they're worried about, is to support the oil states like Saudi Arabia, but they have to be protected. They have to have what the Nixon administration called cops on the beat to protect them. Well, the cops on the beat who were selected are non-Arabs. They do a better job killing Arabs. So the Shah of Iran, the tyrant who we installed, he was one of them. Turkey was another. Pakistan was another. They were providing the Saudi Royal Guard. And Israel became another. They were another cop on the beat. The model is you have cops on the beat. Police headquarters are in Washington. There's a branch office in London, the poodle, as it's sometimes called. And that was the structure. Well, in 1979, the Shah fell. Israel's role increased, and relations got tighter. Meanwhile, Israel was starting to perform secondary services for the United States. So one of the ways of getting around congressional resolutions on South Africa for both the United States and Israel was to have it, and UK, was to have Israel do it. There were congressional restrictions on Reagan on sending, participating directly in the literal genocide that was going on in the Guatemalan highlands. Congress barred direct participation. So Israel was called in. They could do it. Not just Israel, Taiwan, a couple of others. It was kind of like a network, an international terror network that was established, of which Israel was a major part. They're good at this kind of thing. And so it increased. Intelligence relations with Israel are very close. Military relations are extremely close. The U.S. uses Israel even as a base for prepositioning weapons. They're right in the middle of the attack on Gaza. The U.S. was sending weapons to Israel, not for use in Gaza, but prepositioning them for further U.S. actions. Of course, for military industry, Israel's a bonanza. When the U.S. gives arms to Israel, military industry makes a ton of money, but even more than that, it's what's called, in marketing, a teaser. You sell advanced armaments to Israel, then Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states come along and say, hey, we want some of that stuff too. So you sell them way more arms, but of course of lower quality, and they can't do anything with them anyway. So that's just a huge gift from the U.S. taxpayer to military industry. Intelligence, military, and in fact the same is true of high-tech industry altogether. High-tech industry is very supportive of Israel. There's a lot of, take a look at investment. There's high-tech investment going on in Israel, and it's increasing a lot. Intel, the major chip producer, is establishing a new plant, which is, according to their propaganda, is supposed to create a new generation of chips that will be used all over the world. It's in Israel. That's a good place for it. It's very closely tied to the United States. It's a highly inegalitarian society, but there's a wealthy sector, advanced, a lot of startups, with good training of educational, good education for the wealthier sectors, and they're very closely linked to the United States. In fact, they're so closely linked that some of Israeli military industry is actually transferring its facilities to the United States. Because they have better marketing opportunities if they operate here, and they can get supported more easily by U.S. military funding. So it's an extremely tight relationship on all fronts. In contrast, what do the Palestinians offer the U.S.? Zero. It's a nuisance. They're not wealthy. They're not powerful. Nobody likes them. The Arab states don't like them. They're worried about the fact that they stir up nationalism. So they're completely friendless and defenseless. You know, that means they have no rights. You know, it's just elementary principles of statecraft. If you take I don't know if courses like that are given, but if there's a serious course on international relations anywhere, it would say that rights depend on services. If you can serve the powerful, you have rights. If you can't serve the powerful, you have no rights. I mean, it's overwhelmingly the case. It's so overwhelming that it takes purposeful blindness not to see it. So here you have a rich, highly militarized, advanced country right on the periphery of the major oil regions of the world, closely linked to high-tech industry, to the military industry, intelligence, and so on. And in opposition, you have a group that's a pain in the neck. Okay, I mean, the policy almost flows reflexively. So I don't think it's a big problem. And of course, there are constituencies that support Israel. The biggest one by far is the Christian right. Huge constituency, big thing in the United States. In Canada, that's probably the main popular constituency. I mean, they happen to be extremely anti-Semitic, but that's kind of irrelevant. In fact, they're about as anti-Semitic as you can become. And if you look at their doctrines, their ideas is, well, there's going to be, Armageddon, and then all the souls rise to heaven, except for the Jews. Actually, a small number of them, I think 100,000 or so, are allowed, but the rest get wiped out. They go to eternal perdition. Hard to get more anti-Semitic than that. But they're strongly in support of Israeli policies, in part because it's supposed to lead to this. And this goes all the way up to people like George W. Bush. I mean, an unreported, but let's tell you one story about George W. Bush, which I knew a couple of years ago, but it sounded so crazy I didn't believe it, so I never published it. But it's since been confirmed, so now I can talk about it. Before the invasion of Iraq, Bush was, of course, trying to line up European support. And he met with the president of France, President Chirac. This is January 2003. He started talking to Chirac about a very obscure passage from the book of Ezekiel, which nobody understands. There's a passage referring to Gog and Magog. Nobody knows what that means. Are they people? Are they places? What are they? Whatever they are, they come down towards Israel, and that leads to all sorts of conflagrations. And at that point, the Christian evangelical doctrines take off. That's going to lead to Armageddon, and everybody's killed, the souls rise to heaven, and so on and so forth. So Bush started off to Chirac about this stuff, and Chirac hadn't the slightest idea what he was talking about. So he contacted the French Foreign Office, the Élysée. He said, explain to me what this maniac is raving about. And they didn't know either. So what they did is they approached a pretty well-known Belgian theologian who wrote a kind of a disquisition on the interpretation of this passage in Ezekiel and Christian right eschatology and so on and so forth. The way I found out is he sent it to me with a note saying this is what was going on. As I say, I couldn't believe it, so I never mentioned it. But I did mention it to an Australian researcher who looked into it, and it's true. It's reported in the French biographies of Chirac and the French documents. Okay, that's the President of the United States. It's not some guy off and preaching in Texas. Well, that's a big constituency, and Israel caters to it. They understand it. They have programs, in fact, which reach out to Christian evangelicals. I think they even have a journal directed to Christian evangelicals. They know perfectly well that they're anti-Semitic fanatics, but they're supporting Israeli policies. Well, that's a big constituency. There's the intellectual world, which since 1967, as I said, has had a love affair with Israel. That's why you get such good coverage. They're basically right in the media and so on. There's the Jewish community, which has been, particularly since '67, highly supportive, not before, and it's somewhat split. So sure, there are constituencies. There's no Palestinian constituency. I mean, you can build one up. It'll have to be a popular organization like Support for Other National Liberation Groups. So, yeah, those are all factors.
I'd like to talk again about apartheid.
About what?
Apartheid?
Apartheid.
Yeah. You know, unlike the black South Africans, the Israeli Arabs or Israeli Palestinian, within the Israeli state, they have the right to go to university, they have the right to have sexual relationship with whoever they want.
Inside Israel.
They have the, I mean...
Are you talking about inside Israel?
So for the people who said it's not true...
Are you talking about Israel or the occupied territory?
No, I'm talking about Israel. Because
Israel?
Yeah,
well, that hasn't come up today, but if you want to bring it up, I'll be glad to bring it up.
Isn't the title Israel's Apartheid of this conference? It was written in big.
You're bringing up a new topic, an interesting topic, which hasn't been mentioned yet. What about Israel? Everything so far has been about the occupied territories.
Okay, but when you mention Israel's apartheid, it means in all Israel, within the original Israel.
Well, if you want to make that up, okay.
It has to be a clear. It has to be a clear division.
You just ask a question and let him answer.
You're asking.
If people will let me ask the question, then I'll ask my question.
You're asking the question whether Israel itself is an apartheid state, right?
I'm questioning this because it's written in big. You know, it's the week of Israel's apartheid. So I guess
this has to. But the week of Israel apartheid has to do with what we're talking about. The occupied territories. Now, we can raise the question about Israel.
So you agree that within Israel...
I'm glad to talk about Israel.
Let me ask my question, too. I didn't even ask my question.
Okay, ask the question.
Thank you. This is why I'm here.
So what is your question?
So thank you for letting me asking.
Well, I know what the question is, so
okay,
go ahead with it.
I got your comments.
Go ahead and say it. Everyone understands.
So do you agree with that within Israel there's absolutely no apartheid?
Well, that's incorrect, but let's go ahead.
No, okay, so what do you think that what is being apartheid laws or anything about it?
What goes on inside Israel? Okay, I understand.
That was my question. Thank you.
Have you asked your...
I won't move on. Just let me ask my question.
Have you asked your question?
I have the right like anybody else to ask a question.
Why don't you continue with the question? Or are you finished?
This was my question. You know, they can go to school, they have political parties, they even have soccer teams within Israeli leagues. They're just as part of the country as anybody else. So why would you call apartheid on Israel?
Thank you. Now, what you've raised is an interesting question, but a totally new one. Nothing about that has even been mentioned tonight. You can bring up new topics. You can talk about, Western Asia if you want, whatever you want. And this is a new topic. The topic is, what about Israel? I'm talking about, this is a meeting, right? You have heard not one word about Israel so far until you brought it up. But if you'd like to bring it up, fine. So what about Israel itself? Well, actually, it's nowhere near as idyllic as you say. Israel itself has very racist laws, beginning with just the nature of the state. I mean, the High Court, it's the basic law, which is essentially the Constitution, establishes that Israel is the state of the Jewish people in Israel and in the diaspora. Okay, that means it's my state, but it's not the state of its Palestinian citizens. Now, this is not just words. This plays out in policy. The most extreme policy are the land laws. The land laws in Israel are this is Israel itself now, we're not talking about occupied territories. The land laws in Israel itself are a complicated system. I've written in detail about them, as have others, if you want to look it up. But it's a system of laws and administrative practices and bureaucratic arrangements and so on, which ends up with the consequence that 92% of the land of Israel, of the state of Israel itself, is restricted to Jews, to people, if you want the exact wording, to people of Jewish race, religion, and origin. That's the JNF, the Keren Kayemet principle, and they operate the Land Administration Agency under a contract with Israel. Well, that has consequences. And in fact, the history of that is pretty interesting. There's been a lot of protest in Israel about this. It finally reached the High Court in the year 2000. in connection with the town of Katsir. It's a town which is all Jewish, and there was an Arab couple, a middle-class professional Arab couple, who wanted to buy a house in the town. Of course, they were refused. The civil rights group, there was a civil rights organization in Israel. It brought the case through the courts, finally got to the High Court, Supreme Court, and they made a historic decision. They decided in the year 2000 that the Israeli land laws are what we would call unconstitutional, violation of the basic law. Well, 6 years later, that couple was finally allowed into Katsir. But apparently that's the only such case. Meanwhile, the Knesset, the parliament, has tried to remedy this. Kadima, the so-called centrist party, just about a year ago, introduced legislation saying that people can be excluded from a town if the, forget the name, if the town committee decides they're incompatible with the people in the town. Everybody knows what that means. The Likud thought that wasn't harsh enough. Everyone, they talked about it saying, yeah, this rescinds the law. They didn't think it went far enough. Okay, that's where it stands now. Now, is this apartheid? I mean, I wouldn't call it that. That's the United States. We're talking about the United States. I mean, when my wife and I wanted to buy a house in the suburbs when we couldn't pay Cambridge rents back in the 60s, we asked the real estate agent if there was anything for sale in Winchester, which we liked. He told us, well, you wouldn't be happy there. In other words, no Jews. Yeah, it's our own history. It's not a pretty history, and it's very live and real in Israel, and this is only one example. If you look at development programs, they're radically different for Jews and for Jewish citizens and Palestinian citizens. Again, we're pretty familiar with that. I don't think it's anything for us to be proud of, and there have been a lot of struggles to overcome it, but it's still there. And yeah, it's true in Israel, too, very strongly. Should we call it apartheid? Well, I don't. If you want to call it apartheid, okay. But this discussion was about the occupied territories. That's why when I quoted what I said in the Israeli conference, I quoted the history of Bantustans. Actually, I didn't talk there about Israel proper, though it's another question.
All right, sorry, just for lack of time, we're going to try to limit questions. So if you could just ask 2 questions down here and 1 up here, and then we'll have Chomsky answer. I'm sorry for people who've been standing online, but we really do have to wrap this up. So I apologize.
Thank you very much for coming here to speak, Professor Chomsky. I was just wondering, what do you think about the fact that there really is no public knowledge of Israel's dark irony? And by that I mean the fact that a Jewish state used gas, and by that I mean white phosphorus rounds on the largest concentration camp in the world last year. How come that actually has no public image and nobody knows about it?
Sorry,
yes, the white phosphorus on 1,000. Yes, white phosphorus about the Israelis using white phosphorus in Gaza.
Oh, using white phosphorus?
Yeah, but we'll have 2 more questions.
Okay.
Your kids are
Were you asking a question?
Professor Chomsky, I was wondering if you could tell me how you would identify Israel's relationship with the Palestinian people as an apartheid relationship, since the Palestinian people do not seek Israeli citizenship, and they have their own government.
Okay.
That was a question.
Okay. And 1 more?
Okay. Your lecture was really very interesting, and the one optimistic thing that I got from that is that only if the U.S. starts agreeing with the rest of the world and starting disowning Israel as it is today, there's a hope. But what can the people here who support Palestine, what can they do to really mobilize the public opinion? I mean, you are one of them who are doing it, but what is the rest of us? What is it that we can do?
Sure.
Oh yeah, in the United States.
What can people do in the United States?
That's right, to sort of build up the support for Palestinian state.
Support what?
What can people do here to support Palestinian rights?
Yeah.
All right, we're going to have to cut off the speakers there. I'm sorry, it's getting late, and final.
Well, on the white phosphorus, You know, people who read human rights reports know it. It's been reported by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, by the Goldstone Report, and so on. Of course, that doesn't get much traction here. But do you know here about other U.S. crimes? I mean,
sorry, if you could shorten your responses.
Yes.
We'll try to fit in another couple more people.
Yeah. Well, you know, U.S. crimes are not reported, barely reported. So, for example, how many people here know, to pick another part of the world, that the second largest refugee displaced population in the world is in Colombia? And a large part of the reason for that is because of U.S. chemical warfare. It's called fumigation. It's actually chemical warfare, which is driving peasants off the land, opening them up for mining companies and agribusiness and so on. It's created millions of refugees. Anybody know about that? I mean, easy to go on. And for those of you who are interested in becoming a respectable intellectual, you know, in the universities, in the media, and so on, there's some very simple rules. One is focus your attention like a laser on everybody else's crimes, but don't report your own. Okay, in other words, act exactly the opposite of elementary moral principles. It's a very useful lesson. I offer it free advice. So sure, people don't know much about white phosphorus because the U.S. is involved. But it's there, you know, information's all there. Palestinians have their own government. Well, actually, I won't reread what I just said, but Palestinians have their own government less than blacks had their own governments in apartheid South Africa. And the Bantustans had their own governments. And in fact, they were better off than the Palestinians in the cantons. That's what the whole anti-apartheid struggle was about. The farce of blacks having their own governments in the Bantustans. And as I quoted, and of course in Israel nobody objected, yeah, it's even worse in the occupied territories. What can people here do? Anything, you know? I mean, the change, as far as I can see, has to come here. You know, and it can be done. There's many other cases where policy's been turned around. We talked a little bit about the changes of the atmosphere here in the last 20 years. Same thing happened on, you know, Indochina and Central America and anything else on civil rights. You know, it takes work. You know, it's not going to happen by itself, but it's a very free country. You can do lots of things. We're privileged people. You know, a lot of opportunities. Okay, those are the things we can do.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Can you, Mr. Chomsky, can you talk about the anti-Jewish apartheid of the United States, Britain, and some Arab countries, and some certain Islamic groups towards Jews in Israel, which is part of Palestine? And as a result, Israel is a result of a national liberation movement of the Jews. Please talk about it. Last week you presented a book at MIT which argues exactly this point, and you supported this book. Now it's your time to talk about the apartheid against Jews.
Okay, thank you.
So your question, let me see if I understand. The question is, what about Israel being the result of a national liberation movement and the attacks on it? Is that the question?
No, about the apartheid against Jews.
The apartheid against Jews? Yeah, I don't know what
in this building now.
I don't.
You had your question.
If you're a Holocaust denier, fine, but I don't regard the Holocaust as apartheid. It's much worse than that.
And you live
okay, well, you had your question. You had your question. Sir, you had your question.
Fine.
Housing on the stolen land.
Sir, you had your question.
Do you want to talk about the meeting at last week? I'm sorry I didn't raise the questions then, but I'll be happy to talk about it.
Okay. Please answer. How do you feel?
Okay, sir. Sir, you had your question. All right. Next two, really brief, please. Really brief.
The State Department defines, in part, ethnic cleansing as the forceful removal of a people through either murder or force based on religion, race, or the kind of people they are. Do you think what Israel is doing is, in part, ethnic cleansing?
Do I think what they're doing in the occupied territories fits the State Department definition of apartheid?
Yes.
Of ethnic cleansing. Of ethnic cleansing.
What?
Are they committing ethnic cleansing in the?
Oh, ethnic cleansing.
All right, and last question, and this is last question.
Can I ask that you make a question only, please? No comments before or after the question, please.
No problem. Professor Chomsky and the organizers of this event. This is my first time at the AAW, and presumably everyone in the room is here, I hope, are seekers of peace, and it'll be, don't worry, it's going to be okay. Presumably everyone here is seekers of peace, and I'm wondering, with all the accusations and all the propaganda and all the accusations and propaganda, how it is that this week of programming promotes the cause of peace.
Okay. Okay. Well, I don't know if the first questioner is there. I think it may. Oh, are you here? Well, the question is, what about apartheid against Jews? That's a vast understatement. I mean, to talk about, say, the Holocaust as apartheid against Jews amounts to Holocaust denial. If that's your position, just say so. I mean, what the Judeicide was vastly worse than apartheid. So I don't agree with you in justifying the Nazis by calling what they did apartheid. It wasn't that. What about the meeting at MIT last week? Well, a little hard to talk about since no one was there. But there was a meeting in which I introduced a speaker, a legal specialist, who wrote a book, you can read it, and gave a talk on the legal background of the establishment of the State of Israel and what happened in 1949, 48, 49. He went through the Balfour Declaration, the mandate, and so on and so forth. And he argues, I think pretty persuasively, that it was all against customary international law. Yeah, it's persuasive. He even had some very interesting things to say, which I mentioned in my introduction, about why the American Jewish community turned to Zionism. Mentioned some things I didn't know. The most respected person in the American Jewish community, he became a leading Zionist leader, was Justice Brandeis. A very important figure. And it turns out that Justice Brandeis, around 1919, explained to Lord Balfour, author of the Balfour Declaration, why he was getting interested in Zionism. That's a very interesting reason, which in fact I can remember things like this from my childhood. His reason was that he was worried about the fact that Jews from Russia, like my parents, were coming into the United States and contaminating the United States. And he wanted to prevent this. He wanted to make sure that these East European Jews, like, say, my parents, didn't come into our, pure America, which had to be free from this kind of thing. So he became a Zionist. Okay, that's interesting. That has consequences, too. A lot of consequences, and I'm old enough to remember them firsthand. Let's just take one moment, crucial moment. After the Second World War, from 1945, Jews were still dying in concentration camps. Now, there weren't any gas chambers anymore, but the situation was not very different. It was horrible. In fact, Truman sent a mission, Harrison mission, to investigate the DP camps. He came back with a terrible report about how awful it was. What happened to those people, the survivors of the Holocaust? Did they reach the United States? Practically none. If they'd had a chance, they certainly would have wanted to come here. I mean, half of Europe would have wanted to come here. But certainly the survivors of the concentration camps, they didn't come. In part because partly it's just American racism, they didn't want them, and partly the Jewish community didn't want them. If you take a look at there was an immigration bill, Stratton immigration bill. This I'm old enough to remember, I was a teenager. It did call for bringing in immigrants. The only Jewish group that lobbied for it, as far as I recall, was the anti-Zionist group. The American Jewish community here was like Brandeis. They wanted them shipped off to Palestine. Meanwhile, and there's good work on this, first in Hebrew, now translated in English, about how the Zionist movement, this is pre-Israel, took over control of the DP camps and organized organized them so as to force people who were able-bodied, men and women 17 to 35, forced them to go to Palestine to become cannon fodder. It blocked efforts to get them somewhere else. In fact, the Hebrew book, the original book in Hebrew about this, first one to investigate the records, is called Good Human Material. The good human material, able-bodied men and women 17 to 35, have to go to Palestine to be cannon fodder for the coming war. Was that their choice when you survived the Holocaust? Well, maybe for some, but I rather doubt it. So Brandeis's insight is extremely interesting and has a lot of consequences. These are among the many things that were discussed in his book and at the meeting. I don't see what it has to do with what I regard as your apologetics for the Nazis, calling the Holocaust apartheid. There's nothing much worse than that. What about ethnic cleansing? Well, there has been ethnic cleansing, and it's not even denied. In fact, the term ethnic cleansing didn't come into standard use until the 90s. But now, Israeli historians, including the most extreme hawks, like Benny Morris, who thinks that Ben-Gurion's major mistake was not driving all the Palestinians out of the country, he describes what happened as ethnic cleansing, tivur ethni, ethnic purification in literal translation, in 1948. But in the occupied territories, it's not strict ethnic cleansing. It's more like Dayan. They'll live like dogs, and whoever leaves will leave, and we won't give them any opportunities. As I mentioned, there's quite a considerable migration. I don't know the exact numbers, but most of the probably a large majority of the Christians have left, and others with the capacity to leave are leaving because they don't want to live like dogs. It's not, I wouldn't call that ethnic. I don't think it's ethnic cleansing exactly. Ethnic cleansing does apply to what happened in 48 and 49, but what's going on in the occupied territories is much more like apartheid. It's not exactly like South African apartheid. In some respects, it's not as bad. In other respects, it's much worse, as I discussed. Last question. I didn't remember. I didn't manage to write it down. Oh, how does the State Department definition apply to the occupied territories? Was that the question?
Oh, sorry. How does talking about apartheid lead to peace?
Oh, how does talking about apartheid lead to peace? Well, remember, we're talking about apartheid in the occupied territories. The way it leads to peace is quite direct. If the United States is the decisive actor for all the reasons I mentioned, if the United States agrees to end to join the world on accepting a diplomatic settlement, that will overcome the apartheid-type structures that are being imposed by the United States and Israel in the occupied territories. So the connection is very clear. I don't see what the question means, in fact.
All right, one more round of applause for Noam Chomsky.